Hi everyone, this is Matthew Jana for Cardrunners, and I'm here with the Theory of Donk Betting Part 2. We are going to start off with a summary of Part 1 and go over what we have learned. First, we talked about mental blocks. You're probably much more likely to bet the flop out of position when you're the pre-flop raiser than the cold caller for no justifiable reason. This makes sense when we think about how most people were taught to play poker. We also talked about the flop value to bluffing ratio. Very few value bets on the flop relative to bluffs, usually 2 or 3 bluff bets for every one strong value bet. When we say a value bet, we usually are talking about a made hand here, and when we say a bluff, we usually mean some hand that has some small chance to improve, but for the most part it's losing to all the opponent's calling range, or the vast majority of it. Checking the flop out of position. We need a very good reason to bet the flop with the intention of only getting 1 or 2 streets of value in when we're out of position. We should polarize our betting range. It's very, very hard when we're out of position to just bet 1 or 2 streets, because once we get that first or second bet in, we're then going to have to check the later street, and our opponent's probably going to know we have a marginal strength hand, and then he's going to be able to very, very effectively value bet against us and bluff against us. So it's very hard out of position to bet 2 streets, whereas when we're in position, we can just bet flop, bet turn, and then once we check back the river, it doesn't matter if we announce we have a marginal strength hand, the hand is over. Target your bets so you know how many streets of value you can get, and you're playing your hand in a way that manipulates your opponent's range the way you want to. So while manipulating our opponent's range is going to be the main thing we focus on today, and how to manipulate our opponent's range by taking different lines, we simply want to keep in mind that when we are taking a line, we always want to sort of be aware how to balance it. It's very easy to balance in a spot where you either have a really, really strong hand or a really, really weak hand and your range is small. So for example, if someone bets the flop into you and you're in position, it's not very hard to say, well, here are my value raises and here are my bluff raises. Look, it's balanced. We still want to be able to do that when we bet the flop. Even though the turn and the river will often make our lives very tricky, or we're going to have to adjust what we planned on doing, we still want to know we're betting the flop with a balanced range. Donking makes it very easy for us to represent wide, balanced ranges on the turn and river, and if our opponent raises us on the flop, we can destroy his positional advantage if we choose to 3-bet. So this is one of the reasons why people like to bet as the pre-flop raiser so much. It's very easy to have a lot of strong hands in our range no matter what the turn card comes. The same thing applies for the most part when we're donk betting. Now we have an outline for part 2. First was the quick review. We just did that. This is not a series you can jump into halfway. Watch the first video if you have not already watched it. This is probably one of the trickiest theory series, if not the trickiest. So if you don't understand basic concepts, this is probably going to be very confusing. At least watch the first video for this series before you watch this one. We're going to continue with the mathematics to playing the flop, and we're going to compare how betting the flop, check calling, and check raising manipulate the opponent's range. Focus on putting the right hands into the right ranges. So those are the 2 main things we're going to focus on today. How does each line manipulate the opponent's range? And then, once we know how our opponent's range is manipulated, how do we decide what hands to put into what range? Possible line number 1, betting the flop. So when we're out of position on the flop, we'll always have the option to bet since we're first to act, so this is always something we should consider. As previously discussed, when we want to value bet a hand on the flop, it should usually be with a hand that has the intention of betting 3 streets for value on most board textures. So, if the flop comes something like Queen 8-4 with a flush draw, and we bet a hand like pocket 9s, that is not what I'm considering a value bet. Just because the opponent will call with some worse gut shots, some worse flush draws, some worse 8s, that does not mean a value bet in the sense that I mean it, because once we bet the flop, we're going to not know what to do on the turn because we're not going to be able to keep getting value, so we're going to end up checking, and it's going to be pretty obvious we have a relatively weak hand to our opponent. So when I say we have a hand that can be value bet on the flop, it means it can usually bet all 3 streets. It doesn't mean it's a value bet just because sometimes the opponent calls with some worse draws or gut shots. If we bet 0.75 pot size bets, our opponent needs to defend around 60% of his flopping range on the flop, 36% of his range on the turn, and 21.6% of his range on the river. The reason why we keep multiplying by 60% is because when we bet the flop, turn, or river, our opponent usually wants to defend 60% of his range, because if he folds more than that, we can profitably bet any two cards. There are times when it's okay for us to be able to profitably bet any two cards, but if we bet the flop and our opponent called, the turn usually isn't going to be one of them, because then we can just go ahead and fire all of our bluffs because our opponent folds too much. So on the flop, he has to defend 60% of his range. On the turn, he had to defend the original 60% of his range on the flop, but now he multiplies that by 60% again, so he ends up only having to defend 36% of his range on the turn, and then on the river, it's 21.6%. Now, you can't just look at your opponent's flopping range and say, oh, he calls down with the top 21.6% of his range, for a couple of reasons. The first is our opponent also has the option to raise with balanced ratios on each street. This is not the subject of this video, but this requires him to call down an even narrower range than this, since he raises the best hands and mixes in some bluffs on some streets. So that's one reason why he's not just calling down 21.6%, because he can also raise. The other thing to keep in mind is we don't know what the turn or the river card is going to be. So there are sometimes going to be hands that your opponent flops and they're pretty good hands, but the turn and the river comes some weird combination where he actually ends up folding them on the river. Likewise, sometimes our opponent will flop with, 3 to a flush, 3 to a straight, but he'll runner the flush or runner the straight. So that's a hand that looked very, very weak on the flop, but he ends up calling down or raising on a later street. So you cannot just say, hey, the top 21.6% of my opponent's flopping range is top pair third kicker. That's what he's calling down. That might be true, but it also depends on the turn and the river card. Betting and raising probably happens much less in theory than you likely currently think it should. A lot of old books say if a hand is strong enough to call, it's strong enough to raise, or something similar. No, it isn't. That does not make any sense. In theory, raising is a really big deal, because if your opponent's already betting with a polarized range, once we raise against a already polarized range, that's very, very significant. And lastly, the final pot size will usually be around 8 big blinds times 2.5 to the third power, or 125 big blinds. The reason why this is 2.5 to the third power is simply if we're betting 0.75 pot size bets on the flop and our opponent calls, that's 1.5 pot size bets that went in on the flop, so the pot is 2.5 times bigger on each following street. So on the turn, the pot's 2.5 times bigger than it was on the flop. On the river, it's 2.5 times bigger than it was on the turn, and after we bet the river, it's 2.5 times bigger than it was when we first saw the river card. So when you do the math, the final pot will be around 125 big blinds. You should probably be very familiar with that being around the usual pot size when all 3 streets are bet. Visualizing our range composition after bet. We start out bluffing a lot, between 2 to 3 bluffs for every strong made value hand. Just like on the turn, it of course matters what exactly your value hands are, what exactly your bluffs are, how much equity each of those hands have. But for the most part, you want between 2 to 3 bluffs for every strong made value hand. So that usually ends up with you bluffing a little bit more than 2/3 of the time, and you're value betting a little bit less than 1/3 of the time. So when we bet the flop, we usually are bluffing. On the turn, we need around 1 bluff for every 1 made value hand. So that's something that I don't think I've talked about too much, but if you do the math for it, you're going to usually want to have around an equal ratio of value bets to bluffs on the turn, so that one's kind of easy. And then on the river, by the river, the vast majority of our bets must be value bets. For 0.75 pot size bets, our opponent only needs to win 30% of the time when we bet for him to make a plus EV call. So if we want to make our opponent indifferent to calling with a bluff catcher, which is what a large portion of our opponent's river range should be, we need to be betting for value 70% of the time. So really take a moment and think about this, because people often understand the math for river bets. They understand, oh, when I'm betting the river, I calculate the pot odds I give my opponent so I can figure out how much I need to be bluffing, and they have no sense whatsoever of how that changes whether you're on the flop or the turn. When you're on the flop, whether you are betting or bluff raising, betting or bluff raising, and even if it's in a 3-bet pot, the frequencies will change based on what you're doing, but for the most part, you're going to have a lot of bluffs and only a little bit on value. On the turn, you're going to be somewhere in between, around a 1-to-1 ratio when you're just normally betting. If you raise the flop and are following through on the turn, or if it's a 3-bet pot, it's going to look a little bit different. But you don't just calculate the pot odds, you're giving your opponent to figure out what your value range should look like, or what frequency of your bets should be value bets. So keep this in mind. Make sure you understand this. On the flop, you should mostly be bluffing. It theoretically makes sense. On the river, you should mostly be value betting. How draws affect each range is not a subject for discussion here, since it will change based on the street since the equity changes. In general, draws don't alter the ratio of value bets to bluffs much on the flop. So, depending on the board texture, because not all board textures have reasonable draws, it may be that we keep sort of this ratio, this value to bluffing ratio on the flop, but we also add in maybe like now 10% of our bets on the flop are draws, or 15% of the bets on our flop 50% of our bets on the flop are draws, depending on the board texture. So just keep that in mind. We are kind of ignoring draws, but they also don't really affect the ratios very much on the flop, and on the turn they only affect it slightly. So remember, while the exact ratios are going to change on every street based on whether the pot was a 3-bet pot, a squeeze pot, a 4-bet pot, based on whether we just bet the flop in or out of position, or whether or not we raised against our opponent's bet, all these ratios are going to change. That same general concept where you are bluffing at a much higher frequency on the flop than you are on the river is pretty much always going to be true. I can't think of an exception off the top of my head. So you on the flop should be bluffing much more often than you are on the river, and in the more common spots, like when you're just betting in a normal raised pot, you should really have a good sense of what your range looks like, because that's going to tell you how to respond on different turn cards or if your opponent raises. So remember this slide right here. We are not value betting very often on the flop in a raised pot. Make sure you understand what your range looks like. If you do not know what your range is supposed to look like on the turn and river, you're going to be very reluctant to donk bet the flop because it's not what you're used to. You're just going to go ahead and take the lines you already know, because then you have some idea how people respond to them, and then also you know if you take the generally accepted line, you're probably not going to be criticized or confuse people if you ask them about a hand history later on if you get lost. People will understand why you're lost because they would have played the hand the same way you did up to that point. Though if this is the case, you probably also don't know how to continuation bet and double barrel and triple barrel effectively either, since they're pretty much the same thing. Remember, it doesn't really matter if we're donking the flop or if we're just continuation betting. Either way, we're betting into the flop when we're out of position. Knowing what your range looks like will make you feel more comfortable when facing pressure. On the flop, you will probably need to call with some bluffs, which may actually beat your opponent's bluffs, as in the case of ace-jack on a king-queen 4 rainbow board. Your value hands in strong draws are obviously going nowhere. So as we just showed, when we have our flop betting range, which only consists of a small fraction of value, around a third, if our opponent raises our flop bet and he only needs to get folds half the time, we can't. Not only do we have to call with all of our value hands that we're betting, we also have to call with bluffs. Some of those bluffs, like ace-jack on this king-queen 4 rainbow board, are actually going to be ahead of most of our opponent's bluffs, because when he raises, he's having a very polarized range, so he's going to be raising worse gut shots and stuff like that with mostly worse gut shots on this board, but he'll be raising hands that the nut ace high actually beats. On the river, you will almost certainly need to be folding some of your value hands. Likewise, we showed how on the river, the vast majority of our betting range should consist of value hands, so if our opponent raises us and needs to get folds half the time to break even, we have to be folding value hands, or else he would never have any incentive to bluff. We're calling way, way too much if we call with all the hands that value bet on the river, and we're folding way, way too much if we ever fold any value hands on the flop. Oops. How does this theory relate to practice? Maybe this is why some people are so afraid to value bet the river, because without understanding the math, through trial and error, they have some sense of how they'll need to be folding value hands. They'll say something to themselves like, I'll check so I don't get owned. So one of the really important reasons to understand theory well is it helps you actually exploit your opponents, and sometimes when you start doing math, it might make sense why people have a leak that a lot of people have. So here, in my personal opinion, I think so many people at small stakes are afraid to make thin value bets on the river because they hate the idea that when they get check raised, they'll have to fold a strong hand. But we just showed mathematically how that makes sense. If our opponent is raising on the river and he makes, a reasonable raise size, so he needs folds half the time, well, we need to be folding some of our value hands, because if we're not, then we're bluffing way, way too much on the river, and all of our opponent's bluff catchers are going to make a ton of money by calling. So whenever you start doing theory, you always want to kind of think, okay, maybe I can use this theory that I now understand and other people don't to help me understand how to exploit them better. We're now ready to discuss possible line number 2, the effects of a check raise. When we check raise out of position, we do several things. We give our opponent the chance to check back and remove a street from the game while taking a free card. We greatly strengthen our opponent's continuing range compared to betting. And we greatly increase the size of the pot. All these are quite substantial, so if we are going to consider check raising, we want to make sure we're okay with all of this. The expensive nature of a check raise allows our opponent to fold a very large portion of his range by the river. Our opponent bets 6 big blinds into an 8 big blind pot. If we check raise, we risk 18 big blinds to win 14 big blinds. This is the standard size I see most people use in this spot, and it seems very reasonable. He must defend at least 44% of the time. If we bet, so that's on the flop, he must defend at least 44% of the time on the flop because we risked 18 big blinds to win 14 big blinds. If we bet 25 big blinds into 40 big blinds on the turn and 55 big blinds into 90 big blinds on the river, he must defend at least 62% of his range on the turn and river. If we multiply all these percentages together, we get a total 17% faulting range. So, by using these numbers, if our opponent bets the flop and we check raise, he needs to be willing to fault 17% of his flop betting range. This means our opponent will usually have to fault around 20% of his flop betting range to your check raise to prevent free rolling. So, when we check raise, our opponent's not usually going to defend just the minimum because he doesn't want to let us see free cards when we have, overcards or whatever else can outdraw him. So he's probably going to call a little bit more than 44% of the time on the flop and a little bit more than 62% of the time on the turn. So when you change these numbers a bit, you're probably going to get to around 20% of the flop betting range faulting rather than just 17%. These requirements combine to make check raising require a very, very strong hand. Look at how strong the top 20% of our opponent's flop betting range will be by the river, especially against opponents who don't auto-bet when check to. Many overpairs and sometimes even two-pair hands often won't be doing very well after getting a variety of mediocre turn and river cards. 7-6 suited of spades crushes just about everything on a 9 of hearts, 7 of hearts, 6 of clubs board, but how many turns and rivers will make your life miserable in a now bloated pot out of position? So this is something that I see people get confused on all the time once they start trying to use frequencies better. They'll look at how often their opponent needs to felt when they check raise, and they'll say, oh, 7-6 suited does well against my opponent's range on the flop. If I look at his top 20% of his hands, two pairs beating the vast majority of his range. The problem is on a board like 9 of hearts, 7 of hearts, 6 of clubs, just because our hand is ahead on the flop doesn't mean it's still going to be ahead on the river. So after we get a random turn card and a random river card, it's now much less likely that the hands that keep calling down are going to be hands that we beat, because usually some sort of flush, some sort of straight, as well as some other two pairs are going to get there. So a hand like 7-6 suited, which looks awesome on the flop because it's very rare we're beat on the flop, it's not awesome on the river. It's usually not going to be a hand that you feel great about going all in with on the river, because the opponent's going to often be able to fold almost all worse hands, and he's only usually going to defend much better hands. So remember, when you are asking yourself a question like, how often is my hand beat right now? That is a very, very important question to often ask yourself, but you also need to ask yourself, how likely is my hand to be outdrawn on when I am ahead? So for example, if we were to find that 7-6 of spades right here is only behind 5% of the time on the flop, that's great. The problem might be that all the hands that we're ahead of that are calling our flop check raise have a very, very good chance of outdrawing us. If our opponent only needs to end up faulting 20% of his flop betting range, most of his draws, like flush draws or straight draws or some other type of combo draw, those hands all usually have over 20% equity. So unless we runner blanks, we're going to be in a very, very tough spot on the turn or the river, because now we're going to have literally a bluff catcher, because we're going to know, oh, our hand's not strong enough to keep value betting, but we also hate checking out of position and letting our opponent randomize his value bets and his bluffs against us when we pretty much announced we have a marginal strength hand at that point. So really think about that when you are trying to use frequencies and ratios, especially if you're not very comfortable with it. You can't just look at how often you're beat at that point. You also have to think, how often am I going to be beat on a future street? That's why if you're just using computer programs a lot of the time, when you're not really understanding exactly, the details of what's going on the flop, you're not going to get very good answers. So here, if I am holding a hand like 7-6 of spades, I'll think to myself real quickly while I'm playing, you know what, if I check raise and the turn comes a heart, that's really going to suck. and it's also going to suck if my opponent checks back the flop. But if I bet the flop myself, then I know he's not going to just get a bunch of free cards. And when the turn flush card does come, I feel a lot better about that when I donk bet than if I check raise, because when I donk bet, his range is now stronger on the turn. So if the turn does come like a queen of hearts, I'm not as upset as I would be if I had check raised. So just ask yourself questions like that when you're trying to determine what to do. More thoughts on check raising the flop. When we check raise the flop and our opponent calls down, the final pot is around 200 big blinds. When we bet all 3 streets and our opponent calls down, the final pot is around 125 big blinds. This is around a 60% increase. As of right now, I think this 60% increase in the size of the pot isn't enough to justify the downside of check raising in many spots. I personally prefer check calling and donk betting strong hands much more than I used to, despite winning most of my money when I was very raise happy. So when I was learning how to play, I didn't really understand how to donk bet. No one really taught it to me, and I was kind of just doing what everyone else did. So I was very check raise happy, and I did win a lot of money playing that way. You can, of course, still do that, but you are going to find that usually considering a donk bet is going to be a very useful thing to do, because a lot of spots donk betting is just much superior to check raising. I also know how to overbet now, which can get all the money in if I did bet rather than check raise the flop. That's also a useful tool, which makes donk betting overall more valuable, because now you have the option to overbet. When stack sizes are deeper, check raising may become a better option. For example, if stack sizes are 140 big blinds deep, now putting in a check raise seems more appealing, since rather than winning an extra 75 big blinds, we can win an extra 155 big blinds. So one of the reasons why I don't like check raising nearly as much as I used to is I don't think a check raise makes the final pot bigger by enough to justify all the bad things that a check raise does. Check raising risk giving free cards, and makes the opponent's range much more strong, and the final pot really just isn't that much bigger to justify the check raise, in my opinion, for 100 big blind stacks. As we get deeper, now when our check raise is successful and we were 140 big blinds deep, that makes the final pot 150 big blinds bigger if we get all the money in after the check raise, which we'll usually be able to, than if we were to have just gone bet for 75% pot size bets. That's a much bigger increase than if the stack sizes are only 100 big blind deep, where the final pot is now only 60% bigger or 75 big blinds bigger than if we would have just gone bet. So even though I'm not a big fan of check raising anymore compared to how big of a fan I used to be, I also acknowledge that as you change stack sizes, that is going to change. Determining whether or not to check raise. So when to consider check raising? The opponent will bet the flop at a very high frequency. So in practice, this is going to be true much more often than it should be, so exploitatively, check raising can be very good. You should be check raising all the time in practice against specific opponents. So even if you are trying to play and understand theory very well, don't think it's okay to not check raise a lot. You need to exploit opponents who are just going to give you money because they bet the flop too often. Our hand is strong enough to keep value betting most turns and rivers, yet still vulnerable to our opponent's bet folding range. So a good example of that might be when we check raise a set that doesn't want to give free cards to a lot of our opponent's gut shots that bet the flop. So if we check raise a set, now maybe our opponent will fold a lot of his gut shots on the flop, so we don't have to worry about them outdrawing us on the turn. Yet when he does call, maybe he'll have a lot of sort of strong pairs, which our set isn't afraid of outdrawing us at all. So you really want to check raise hands that are just a little bit vulnerable, yet still feel really good about getting all the money in on most turns and rivers. And lastly, we have enough strong hands in our check calling and donk betting range. A lot of times we have only a few really strong hands in our range, and if we only have a few really strong hands in our range, we might not want to put them all in our check raising range, because then that makes our other ranges very vulnerable. We might not even have a donk betting range if our range is very weak, in which case we would only want to check fold or check call. This kind of ties in with the whole the opponent will bet the flop at a very high frequency. If our range is much weaker than our opponent's, he's probably going to be more likely to bet the flop. So in that case, it makes more sense to consider check raising or check calling, because we're going to be more likely to see a bet from our opponent. When to avoid check raising. The opponent will not bet a very high frequency. So some board textures simply hit your range much better than your opponent's. He's not going to bet much on the flop because of it, because you have the stronger hands in your range. So it makes sense. You should usually be the player betting there. You should not be check raising or check calling that many strong hands. Our hand will not be strong enough to keep betting many dangerous turns and rivers. So often on the board textures where your hand feels very, very vulnerable, it's still going to feel vulnerable when you check raise and your opponent's range is stronger on a whole ton of turn and river cards. So don't check raise hands where you're constantly going to be lost on the turn. Our hand is so strong it is not vulnerable to our opponent seeing additional turn cards. Additional cards, turn and river. This one's very, very important, and it's one where I think a lot of people know what to do, but they don't understand why. If you flop a full house, your hand is not very vulnerable to your opponent seeing a free turn or a river card, so you can check call. And you're probably used to doing that in practice. Most people have flopped quads before. It's probably pretty unlikely they check raised it because they said, hey, if I check call, I'll get to keep my opponent's bluffs in his range, and then I can delay my check raise to a later street. That's fine, just understand the math for it, or at least the logic for it. When you're check raising, it's often going to be to make hands that are bet folding fold, that you don't want to see free cards like gut shots. If your hand is that strong that you don't mind giving your opponent free cards at all, you're probably going to want to mostly check call it. And then this next one, our check calling range is very weak and our opponent will double and triple barrel often. So sometimes you have a hand that works pretty well as a check raise, but your overall range is so weak that your opponent's going to keep double and triple barreling so often that you'd rather take a risk and slow play it, even though you're going to be outdrawn sometimes. And lastly, the opponent will often raise your flop bet and your hand plays well as a 3-bet. So remember, the whole reason why we're trying to understand all this math and theory is so we can compare all the lines. It's not all that useful for just understanding how a check raise works if we can't compare it to how effective a bet works. So, if betting allows you to 3-bet the flop out of position so you effectively destroy your opponent's positional advantage, it will still be there when he flats your 3-bet, but for the most part, the stack sizes are much lower. He's not going, and you're not usually going to be playing past the turn, so position won't be as valuable. It makes a lot of sense to bet in these cases because when your opponent does raise, you get a 3-bet a hand that really wants to 3-bet on the flop. So if there is a board texture where you think your opponent is usually going to raise you on the flop with a lot of gut shots or a lot of very strong hands, and your hand beats those strong hands, then it makes a lot of sense to just lead rather than check raise, because now when your opponent does raise, you can make sure you get all the money in, and when he raised a gut shot as a bluff, not only do you get to pick off that bluff, but you make sure he doesn't get to see an additional card. Lastly, make sure the check raise makes sense with your entire range. You always want to think about what your entire range looks like, because even if your hand check raises very, very well in a vacuum, if you don't have the right types of hands to balance it out with, or if it's only one of your few strong hands so it's leaving the rest of your range as very vulnerable, it might not be a very good idea to check raise it against a good player. Also remember, we can delay a check raise until a later street. A check call on the flop does not mean we're calling down. So when we do check call a very strong hand, we of course are planning on raising either on the turn or on the river. Maybe not all turn cards and all river cards, but we're still going to usually be able to put in a raise with a lot of the very strong hands we check called with on the flop. So don't think just because we are check calling, that means we're not going to get all the money in on the river. We often will. The effects of check calling. When we check call our opponent's flop bet, we now keep 100% of our opponent's flopping range in the hand. This is a very significant thing to realize because this is the only line that does it. When we bet the flop or when we check raise, our opponent is usually going to end up folding most, if not all, of his weakest hands. When we bet the flop, he's probably just going to release the bottom 35 or 40% of his range. When we check raise, our opponent's usually going to bet most of his very weak hands on the flop as bluffs. Maybe if he has a really, really bad hand, he'll check it back because it's too weak to even bluff. But for the most part, he'll bet most of his weak hands and have to fold most of them, if not all of them, to our flop check raise. But when we check call, every single hand in our opponent's flopping range is guaranteed to see the turn card, whether he checks back the flop or whether or not he bets it and we check call. If our opponent bets 0.75 pot size bets, we risk 0.75 pot size bets to win 1.75 pot size bets. This means we only need to win 30% of the time to justify a call. Of course, things are more complicated than this as there's more streets left to act, But for the most part, you need to realize how good of a price you are getting when you do check call. It's okay to check call a hand that's not thrilled about check calling and doesn't think it's likely going to end up winning. You're getting a very good price. Our opponent will need to either bet the turn or check back the turn and river with the best hand very close to 70% of the time to make us indifferent to calling with a medium strength hand on the flop. So since we are getting such a good price, if we do check call a pretty mediocre hand on the flop, that means our opponent's either going to need to double barrel a lot on the turn to make us fold that sort of weakish made hand we called with, or he's going to have to check back a better hand. 70% is a pretty big number, so he can't bet the flop too recklessly, or else we're just going to win a lot of money check calling medium strength hands. If you are a noob, and note I spelled it N-E-W-B, which is non-derogatory, compared to N-00-B, which is the derogatory form, pause for a moment and make sure you realize how incredibly high this frequency is. So, make sure if you haven't seen these ratios and frequencies before, how you realize it's okay to call expecting to be in bad shape because you're getting a really good price. There's nothing wrong with calling in spots expecting to lose. So you see this on the river all the time. You'll post a hand, or I'll talk about a hand with someone and I'll think the river is a call, and then they'll say, haha, you were wrong. He had the better hand, it was a fold. That's not what I'm saying at all. All the time I call expecting to lose because I'm getting such a good price. You should too. So don't just think you have to fold if you're expecting to lose. Pay attention to the odds you're being offered. Having said that, it's very important to remember that you can't just look at the equity of your hand and then look at the odds you're being offered to decide whether or not you want to call. It's possible you're going to even need to fold a hand on the flop that has over 50% equity despite being given a very good price, because there are so many streets left to act. Your opponent's going to be able to keep value betting all his strong hands, and he's going to be able to keep letting some bluffs that don't improve drop out of his betting range, and it ends up being a negative EV call on the flop even though you were given a very good price and had over 50% equity. Most people don't understand that. So don't get in the mindset of thinking you can look at the odds you're being offered and look at the equity of your hand and make a decision just based off that. There are a lot of other variables that are very important for making your decision. So as you slowly learn poker, just try to keep understanding more and more of them. Check calling continued. Since we are in general being laid such great odds when we face bets on earlier streets, check calling forces our opponent to follow through often and keeps his range very wide. We just talked about this on the last slide. This is the same reason why it's very rare we want to raise a monster hand for value on the flop or turn if we can delay it until the river. The opponent has to follow through so much that we actually ultimately make him put more money into the pot by calling rather than raising in most spots. We want him to keep betting his bluffs, and we delay our raise until a later street. This is not intuitive even if you're used to doing this. Imagine a friend saying, wait, so you mean to tell me that by calling the flop instead of raising, it lets me get more money in by the river? Really think about that for a moment, because that is what I'm saying. I'm saying you want to check call your very strong hands on the flop and delay the raise. That ultimately gets more money in by the river. That seems backwards. By check calling the flop, you get more money in by the river, whereas by check raising the flop, you get in less money. That seems ridiculous. Yet you also probably know that from playing, when you do flop quads, you feel okay about slow playing it because your opponent will keep bluffing. If our opponent has a nuts or air range on the flop, he will be forced to bet the turn and the river a total of 70% times 70% equals 49%. His bluffs improving to checkbacks or value hands, weakening to checkbacks will reduce his frequency in practice, but it will still be quite high. So if our opponent either had a pure value hand or a pure bluff, and this is for 0.75 pot size bets, of course. If he had pure value or pure bluffs, he needs to follow through 70% of the time on the turn and 70% of the time on the river, because as soon as he checks, we'll know our marginal hand is good because we're never going to be betting. So keep that in mind for a nuts or air range. He needs to follow through 70% of the time, but since he isn't always going to have pure air or he isn't always going to have pure value, it's not actually going to be this high in practice, because sometimes I'll bet a value hand that wanted to bet all three streets but gets a bad turn or river, and other times I'll bet a bluff that was planning on giving up on the turn or the river, but it happened to get a miracle card and now it can start value betting. Wrapping up check calling. One of the problems with check calling is it lets our opponent see 1 or 2 free cards, which is often very risky. If we check raise the flop, our opponent will fold around half the hands he bets. This means he gets to see free cards with fewer of his bluffs. So when we did the math, I showed how usually when you check raise the flop, you're going to be risking more money than you stand to win if your opponent folds. So that lets your opponent fold more than half the time. But your opponent also won't want you to get to see free turn and river cards. So when you take that into account, he's probably going to end up defending around half the hands he bets on the flop. Remember, the cards are free since our opponent's bet is already dead money at that point, and we're not raising him. So once he bets, it's dead money. Just keep that in mind. We now see the previously mentioned trade-off. When we check call with a monster, we keep our opponent's range wider at the risk of letting him see free cards. So exactly how big of a risk it is to give your opponent free cards is going to depend both on your specific hand strength and the board texture. So whenever I'm debating whether or not I want to raise, I'm often going to ask myself, how big of a risk is it to give my opponent a free card, and how many turns and rivers will I still be able to put in a value raise? So if the flop comes something like 10-8-8 with a flush draw, for example, how I would play my trips is going to often be different than how I would play my full houses. And this is, of course, applies whether I'm in or out of position, because my full houses want my opponent to run a runner a flush, or want my opponent to turn a river a straight, whereas my trips do not want my opponent to do that, so I might play those hands in a way which make him more likely to fold his gut shots. So you really want to think about this stuff and really acknowledge the trade-off that's happening. When you do slow play a hand, you're risking being outdrawn on, but you make your opponent put more money into the pot by the river. Is that worth it? Comparing the 3 possible out-of-position flop defending lines. Donk betting, bet. The opponent defends around 22% of his flopping range. Remember, when we bet the flop out of position, we bet directly into our opponent's entire flopping range, and since he needs to call around 60% on the flop, 60% on the turn, little less but around 60% on the river, he ends up defending around 22% of his entire flopping range. Check raising, bet. Opponent defends around 20% of his flop betting range. So his betting range is already a polarized range, and he ends up only needing to defend 20% of that range. Remember, this means our opponent will get to fold some of the hands he was originally betting with for value on the flop. So we talked about that earlier on in this video, but usually when a player bets the flop, they're going to have around, give or take, 30% value hands and 70% bluffs, with draws affecting that a little bit, but not too drastically. So by check raising, since we let our opponent's range get so strong by the river, he's not even defending with all of the hands he was value betting with on the flop, despite his value betting range being quite polarized. This works well for very strong hands that do not want to delay the raise until a later street. A polarized range balanced with bluffs. So when we do check raise a flop, we're of course going to want to balance that with bluffs, and we're going to also want to use some very strong hands as the value component. Check calling. If we check call, the opponent has to follow through and bet the turn or check back the winning hand around 70% of the time. The net result is delaying the raise makes him felt a wider range most of the time. I'm not going to go into the math here. This is not a polarized range. Most of the hands we are check calling with will be medium strength hands. So this, of course, makes sense. We're not going to want to bet with hands which are medium strength because they're not strong enough to bet for value, and we're not usually going to want to check fold them because they're going to be too strong to check fold. So what we're usually going to do with a medium strength hand is put it in the check calling range. That way it beats the opponent's bluffs, and it doesn't put too much money in the pot when the opponent does have a stronger hand, and it allows us to see an additional card. So it's not a polarized range when we are check calling. Now, our check calling range can't only consist of medium strength made hands. We also need to have some draws so we can hit a variety of different turn cards, but for the most part, medium strength hands are going to be what goes in the check calling range. This also works well with incredibly strong hands which fear few turn cards or on board textures where the opponent is likely to fall through an incredibly high frequency of the time due to our overall weak check calling range. So, As we've talked about before, when we do have a hand that doesn't fear any turn or river cards, we'll ultimately put more money in the pot by check calling and delaying the raise until a later street. And in addition, by check calling our very, very strong hands, it does protect our marginal strength hands from our opponent being able to bet too much or to start overbetting. So take a moment and make sure you really understand what each one of these lines does and how it manipulates the opponent's range. By going bet, 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 or check raise, bet, bet, we make our opponent fold some of the weakest hands in his range on every single street. So it of course makes sense to do this with a very polarized range of value bets and bluffs, since we are making our opponent's weaker hands fold, yet he's still going to call down and put more money in the pot with his marginal strength hands. So a very polarized range makes sense here. Whereas when we're the player check calling, by check calling, we guarantee our opponent gets to see the turn with 100% of his flopping range. So if we have a medium strength hand, we of course want to keep our opponent's range very, very wide, because a medium strength hand has the best chance of winning against a very wide range. So when we check call, we have the opposite of a polarized range. We have hands that are mostly towards the middle and medium strength hands. But we also are going to mix in, some decent draws and some really, really strong hands on some board textures, so we can hit a variety of turn and river cards. Let it all sink in. We've just gone over a mathematical blueprint for deciding how to approach the flop. Yes, there are a ton of frequencies and ratios you need to know to play the flop out of position very effectively, but now you at least have a sense for how betting, check calling, and check raising manipulates your opponent's range. Just because we know how each line manipulates our opponent's range does not mean we know exactly what our range should look like. For example, what percentage of your turn bets should be bluffs after check raising the flop? So the reason why I'm pointing this out is a lot of times when you learn a lot of new theory, you have a tendency to think you know more than you actually do. There's been several times where I thought, okay, I totally get how this concept works, and then later on I think, oh wait, there's another variable that I didn't take into account. And that's not really that bad of a thing. That's kind of just how poker works. You have to learn sort of one small step at a time, and then what you learn will still usually be very useful. And if it's not useful, you'll usually figure it out relatively quickly when it starts losing you money. But you don't want to think you know more than you actually do. So we've kind of compared how betting, check raising, and check calling messes with our opponent's range. But other than showing how when you bet the flop, you should be bluffing a ton, less on the turn, then less on the river, we haven't really done that much work with our own ranges. And of course, since this is a donk betting series, we're not going to go into how check raising works on later streets and all that kind of stuff. So just don't think you know more than you do. We instead just kind of have a really good starting point for balancing our donk bets on the flop, and at least some idea of when we should check raise and when we should donk bet and when we should check call. Without understanding all the math and ratios for all the possible flop lines, you can still ask yourself which line manipulates my opponent's range in a way that's most effective for this specific hand. This is going to be key for balancing ranges. The ratios and frequencies will restrict what we can and cannot do, but who cares if we use these ratios correctly if we're putting value hands in the wrong ranges? So it's really both things. You have to have some sense of what ratios you're able to use against really good opponents, or they'll realize you're bluffing too much or value betting too much. But even if you do have, it's very difficult sometimes to tell whether or not a value hand belongs in a check call range, a check raise range, or a donk betting range. And sometimes, to be honest, even if I'm playing with Flopzilla and I've seen similar spots before, I still can't figure out what's actually probably best in theory. So then if I were actually playing the hand, I would just look at my opponent's stats and make the best guess that I could based on whatever stakes I'm playing at the time. So it's important to sort of know all this kind of stuff, but for the most part, you're really going to want to look at your opponent and try to ask yourself, what line manipulates my opponent's range best based on how my opponent plays? So that brings us to part 3 of the video series, which is putting the right hands into the right flop ranges. So we are going to begin working on this right now, but we're not going to get anywhere near through all of it since we've only got about 15 minutes left. But let's go ahead and get started. Approaching problems. Quick theory lesson. Theory is often very bad at helping us find the correct answer to tough problems. Theory can very rarely give us the right answer to complex spots. Theory is, however, awesome at telling us when something is wrong. While we can't usually tell if a range is correct, we can usually tell if a range is incorrect. For example, we can quite easily tell if a player is using a bad blind defense 3-betting range or flatting too little. We cannot find out what the exact correct range is. So this is a very important thing to remember, that poker is way too complex of a game that there are simply some spots where you're not going to be able to get a very clear answer. You're going to be able to use theory to tell if something's wrong, and it will slowly get you closer to the correct answer. But for the most part, you're going to have to make a lot of estimations, and you're always going to have to be very willing to improve what you already have. If you ever study the scientific method in grade school or maybe in college, you probably know that you're supposed to make a hypothesis, and your goal is to try to prove your hypothesis wrong. That's how science works when you use the scientific method. So I would kind of take the same approach when using poker theory. Use poker theory to make the best estimation you can of how something works. Then as you get better, you play more spots, you start thinking more, you start understanding more complex variables that you didn't even realize were there. You simply update the theory to take into account these new concepts, and you never actually are going to prove something right, but you will be able to prove stuff wrong and keep updating the model. Okay, so what does this have to do with donking? Why am I talking about the scientific method in a poker video? Well, in that same line of thought, it is usually harder to see if a hand is a good donk betting candidate than it is to see if it is an awful check calling or check raising candidate. This is how I slowly learned to donk, not by trying to solve a range all at once, but by beginning to donk with hands on board textures I did not want to check call or check raise with the specific hand I had. We will first analyze spots where it is very hard to check raise and check call effectively. We will then slowly work our way to donking on more difficult board textures with less obvious hands and with a balanced range, keeping the math from the previous section in mind. So with our last 10 minutes or so, I'm probably going to bring out Flopzilla. I'm going to randomly generate some boards, and we're simply going to just discuss what we already learned about, how would check calling manipulate our opponent's range, how would check raising, how would donk betting, and then we'll just make the best guess that we can without writing down all the possible combos for what looks like a correct line. Alright, so the most common spot where you're probably going to be donking is when you flat in the big blind against a button open. That's the spot that occurs the most often, and you're probably going to start using a very wide flatting in the big blind range against a button open as people start making their button opens smaller and smaller, and as you get much more comfortable with donking. I'm much less afraid to play out of position than I used to be because donking solves a lot of problems that you had when you only started out with checking on the flop. So what we're going to do is we're going to not talk about exactly what our big blind flatting range is. We haven't gotten there yet. We're going to just simply randomly generate some flops against a 45% button opening range and see how each of our lines will influence his range. So let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so usually when I stutter or I don't know what to say for a few seconds, I just delete the recording and then I just record it again. But I've done this a few times now, and it's really hard to sort of figure out the flop out of position on the fly when you have a very wide big blind range against a button open. So you're probably just going to have to hear me sound like an idiot as I try to figure out what I would do. But let's stop doing that and go ahead and get started. So here we go. Oh, that's a really easy one. That's nice. Jack of hearts, four of clubs, two of spades. So this is an incredibly dry board where almost everyone starts out checking. Let's analyze this. So on the flop, if we have a hand like ace-jack, we are only beat 4.6% of the time by our opponent. That is not often at all. There are going to be times when you have two pair or a set and other spots where you're actually beat more often than we are with ace-jack here. So what I'm trying to get at is if we actually have ace-jack beat on the flop, it's pretty much a cooler as far as I'm concerned, because ace-jack is an extremely strong hand here. We're only behind 4.5% of the time. The next thing I would do is I would look at how often hands like king-jack are beat. So let's look at king-jack. King-jack is beat in overpairs 22 combos, so we add on the additional 8 ace-jack hands that beat that, so that's going to be 30 combos. So then we would get out our calculator, and it would be 30 divided by 493. 30 divided by 493. So that gives us 6.1%. So when we have a hand like king-jack, we're only beat 6.1%. So both king-jack and ace-jack are extremely strong on this board texture. And so those hands are going to be very good hands to donk, and you would also find that this flop hits the big blind flatting range much harder than it hits the button opening range. We may or may not be able to have pocket fours or pocket twos in our range. As I said, I don't want to get exactly into what's in the big blind flatting range, so this could be a very rare board texture where we actually don't have any sets and our range is capped at ace-jack. But even if our range is capped at ace-jack, it's still a relatively strong hand where there's not many hands that beat us. So this would be a board texture where I would really consider donking ace jack and king jack. You don't need to necessarily donk all of them, but at least a lot of them. And then you want to balance it out with the right types of bluffs. So the kind of hands that are going to be the right types of bluffs here are usually going to be hands that work well for bluffing in most spots. Hands that can turn draws that let us know very clearly we want to keep betting. So for example, a hand like 10-9 of hearts is going to make an excellent hand to donk here. A hand like almost anything that can run a runner a hand. So even something like a king 5 of clubs, you might find makes a reasonable hand to donk here because a 3 or a 6 gives us a gut shot, and a king gives us top pair, and a club gives us a flush draw. So even a hand like king 5 of clubs, which you're probably used to just insta check folding, if you do flat it in the big blind and get a flop like this, it's a very reasonable hand to use as a donk bet to bluff with. So you really want to think about when you are donk betting on a flop like this, how often am I behind? Is his range stronger than mine, or should I be the player betting? And then also think, what hands can I bluff with that will tell me clearly that I should be betting the turn? So king 5 of club works very well here. So on a board texture like this, I'm usually going to be donk betting most of my ace jack and king jack. I think queen jack would probably be relatively close. I'd probably call with most weaker jacks than that, and if I did have a set, I would check call it to sort of protect my checking range, and because I'm just beat so rarely on this flop, I feel okay about stacking off with ace jack. So if I did donk this flop and my opponent raised me, I probably wouldn't 3-bet almost anything because the board's very dry and I'm not afraid of giving free cards. But by the same token, I'm not afraid of having a range capped at ace jack. So if I only have a very limited number of sets here, like if I can only have pocket 4s, I'm fine with check calling all of them and my donking range being capped at ace jack. So this is a board texture I really do like donking, and you just got to make sure you're randomizing with the right types of hands at the right ratio. And I just realized king 5 suited actually gives us an open-ended straight draw when we turn to 3, which is even better. So I think that's a very reasonable hand to donk here. To be honest, I would have to take a moment to figure out if it's exactly in my donking range, but it looks like a good guess and a good place to start when you're actually playing at the tables. So let's randomly generate another one. 8-7-7. Okay, so this one's a little bit different. This is a board texture where I don't think it hits our range better than our opponents in the big blind. I'm usually personally 3-betting a lot of hands like 7-5 suited and 7-6 suited. Even though they are strong enough to call with, I would rather use them as a 3-bet bluff and call with some hands like, Jack 10 off or Queen 10 off, which play better in raise pots. Whereas 7-5 suited or 7-6 suited play better in 3-bet pots. So this is a board texture for my specific range. I think it actually doesn't hit it all that well. So since this misses my range relative to my opponents, I'm going to see how often I'm beat. If I have a hand like 7-6 of diamonds or 7-5 of diamonds, as I said, I probably 3-bet that hand mostly. So actually, let's even go 7-9 of diamonds. It's very rare that I'm beat on the flop. So this would be a reasonable spot to consider check raising a hand like that. I could check call with it as well if I'm not really afraid of any turn cards, though my opponent does have some gut shots and open-ended straight draws and can run a runner flush as well. But since my range is relatively weak on the flop, I would probably be pretty likely to check call with 7-9 suited because I want to protect myself from being bet very aggressively on the turn. So this is a spot where I don't like having a donking range almost at all for my specific range because I'm out of position with a weak range. So that's usually a really good indicator that I don't want to be betting with almost anything. And if I do have a really strong hand that does want to put money in the pot, I probably will get more money in the pot by check calling because I know my opponent's going to be betting so much. So I can either check call or check raise. And here I'm not really too afraid of any turns, so I'd probably prefer to check call. Alright, so I just put in 9 of hearts, 8 of hearts, 6 of diamonds because I intentionally wanted to use at least one flop that illustrates some of the concepts I was talking about where we have problems when we check raise. So on this flop right here, if we are holding a set on the flop, we are only beat, let's imagine we have the worst set, we are only beat 2.7% of the time. So we're pretty much not beat at all when we have a set. Now the problem quickly becomes when we do check raise, we need to see what turn cards put us in a really, really tough spot. So in order to do this, it's not really safe to look at your opponent's entire range on the flop and see how strong that entire range would be on the turn, because the opponent should be betting a polarized range, and that should consist of a lot of draws, a lot of value hands, and a whole lot of bluffs. So it's very difficult to just look at Flopzola and very accurately determine how often you're beat on the turn based on the turn card because your opponent doesn't have this entire range on the turn. Nevertheless, people usually bet the flop too much, and once you check raise, their range will probably be even stronger than it is on the turn if you just look at their entire range. Because most people just get a flop, they bet way too often, then when you check raise, they'll call maybe half the time, so they're kind of getting to the turn with their better draws and their better hands. So if Flopzilla tells you with their entire flopping range, they'd have you beat 12% of the time, chances are in practice they're going to have you beat significantly more than that. So let's keep that in mind and see what we can see when we just play around a little bit. So now we're going to want to look at a 5, 7, 10, and heart turn and see how many stronger hands that puts into our opponent's range. So once again, right here we are going to be basically making an estimate because we are assuming our opponent bets and calls with his entire flopping range if we just look at how much we're beat on the turn and we keep all these hands right here. And I know that's not perfectly accurate, but it's pretty safe to say if the turn card strengthens our opponent's range very, very significantly, if he were to bet and call with his entire range on the flop, then in reality, when he's betting on the flop with a very polarized range, that includes a lot of really good draws, a lot of combo draws, a lot of strong made hands, and he does call our check raise, I'm guessing the vast majority of the time then the turn card's going to improve his range significantly more than it even shows up right here. So if you have more time, make a more precise bet calling range for your opponent, but right here this will still give us a good estimate, and then we'll of course go into much more precise detail in future parts of the series. Okay, so let's start out looking at a offsuit 5. That gives our opponent a set or better on the turn 14.2% of the time, and the vast majority of those hands, other than pocket 5s, literally all of them, are going to beat us. So a 5 doesn't look like it's a very good turn, which is kind of what we expected. We're going to be beat a lot and be pretty uncomfortable about betting. On a 7, our opponent has us beat just a huge amount of the time. He has us beat 29.1% of the time. So if we did check raise pocket 6s on the flop, we'd pretty much be going into check call mode already on a 7 turn card. That's nothing really surprising there. And a 10, which arguably in practice is probably going to be one of the worst ones because people will bet call the flop with a lot of queen jack off hands, and also they'll bet the flop with a lot of 7s, which are going to be either open-ended straight draws or combo draws. So right here it says we're beat 17.9% of the time on the turn, but in reality I'm guessing it'd be much, much higher than that because most of the hands that hit the 10 are going to be hands that bet call on the flop, I believe. Alright, so those turn cards were all really bad. Let's look at a heart. So a heart only puts a better hand in our opponent's range. Let's make it a higher heart, actually. Let's make it a king of hearts. So the heart only puts a better hand in our opponent's range on the turn for a total of 8% of the time. So that's not as high as I was expecting, and that doesn't look awful. So it looks like right here, even though we would want to be more precise when we were actually figuring this out, it looks like it's probably pretty reasonable against a button open to go ahead and check raise this board and keep betting on a heart turn. We're still running a very big risk whenever the turn card comes a 10, a 7, or a 5, but a heart doesn't look that devastating. We also have to keep in mind when we do check raise the flop, our opponent probably isn't going to have pocket 9s, pocket 8s in his range anymore. But once again, we'll have to put a more precise range in to figure this out exactly. But a heart here doesn't look that devastating because the button's opening a lot of offsuit hands. If we're playing against an opponent that doesn't c-bet very widely, and if he has a range that is composed of a greater frequency of suited hands pre-flop, they have just more suited cards, then the king of hearts would probably be a much worse turn card because he'll have much more flushes in his range. So usually when I make a video, I intentionally put incredibly easy hand examples in it because I want my examples to be crystal clear and I want to make sure everyone understands the very basic concepts. When I make Flopzilla videos, I'll randomly generate flops and turns. I'll deal with much tougher spots and explain what I think I would do if I was trying to figure out what to do relatively quickly. But in theory videos, I really try to keep things very clear. Here I did not do that. I actually randomly generated some flops that I actually feel like I have a really good sense of whether or not I would donk, what types of hands there are, whether or not I check call or check raise. But I hand-picked the most difficult flop I could find, which I think is something like 9-8-6 two-tone. That's around as difficult of a flop as you can get when you're out of position with a very, very wide range against a very, very wide range. The reason I did that is I really want to illustrate how difficult it is to tell what to do in some spots when you are out of position with a wide range, and how you will find a lot of really good players that have a disagreement about what should be done here. Right here, for example, I could easily see a very good player saying, this is a spot where I would prefer to check raise because I know how hard this board is to play out of position, and I think my opponent knows it too, so he's probably going to want to be betting here with a very, very wide range, so the pot gets bigger and it's hard for me to keep calling down out of position. So I would rather check raise now, make my opponent pay to see another card, and then if the heart comes on the turn of the river, I don't think it's all that bad. Yet if a 10-7 or a 5 does, I'm simply going to go ahead and have to deal with that. I don't want to let my opponent see free cards, and I want to aggressively protect some of my checks. I could easily see that being a very, very good argument from a very, very good player. Likewise, I could see a very good player saying, no, I'd rather donk bet here, because if my opponent raises, that gives me the opportunity to 3-bet, so my opponent will have already put a lot of money into the pot at that point, and I'll make the pot very, very big with the stack sizes very small relative to the pot on the turn. So 3-betting is a very good thing to be able to do with the set on this flop, and also I'll be able to more easily keep value betting some turn cards. It might be very hard to value bet a Queen of Hearts, for example, after you check raise the flop, but it will probably still be relatively easily to do if you donk bet the flop. Once again, that's another really reasonable set of arguments. It's very, very difficult to tell which one's correct here. So I guess the point I'm trying to make here is we're now doing a difficult enough theory series where it's not going to be like it was in the past, where I can very clearly show if something's correct or incorrect. It's incredibly hard to prove whether or not we should be check raising or donking with a hand like pocket sixes on a 9-8-6 board with a flush draw when we're out of position and our range is incredibly wide and our opponent's range is incredibly wide. If someone told me something incorrect regarding pre-flop frequencies, I could for the most part get out a piece of pencil or a pencil and a piece of paper and show them they're wrong, or if it's over to the internet, type it out and show it why they're wrong. Here, if someone's going to say, no, pocket sixes is a donk bet, or someone else is going to say, no, it's a check raise, that's incredibly difficult to prove. So you want to understand the theoretical concepts behind it. Understand how each different line will manipulate your opponent's range, but you're not always going to know exactly how you want to manipulate your opponent's range. I don't know whether or not it's better to donk bet sixes or check raise it. I know how each one will influence my opponent's range, but I still don't know which one's better, and if I was going to get a very strong opinion about it, it would probably take me several hours of sitting down with Flopzilla and trying to work it out. That's not a reasonable thing to do for most people most of the time, so understand the underlying concepts and also acknowledge this is going to be one of those concepts where you're just going to keep slowly improving. It's not going to be like overnight, oh yeah, I get this, I know exactly how to play. Which still wasn't the case for pre-flop, but it was a lot closer where you could easily fix your 3-betting ranges after probably watching the theory series. So, having said all that, I hope you enjoyed this theory series. I hope you learned a lot. I look forward to reading your comments in the forums, and I wish you guys good luck. See you later, everyone. Bye.